So first, I'll give you the rankings, and secondly, I will give you the justification for the rankings. The rankings is as follows. We gave the first to closing government, second to opening opposition, third to opening government, and fourth, unfortunately, to closing opposition. So in the order of first to fourth, CG, OO, OG, and CO. And I will note that as for the margins, the difference between first and second and the difference between third and fourth are fairly close. I will note that. Okay, so let's first jump into the opening exchange. So what did opening government have to say in this debate? First, I think opening government gave us a vast amount of problem analysis of the status quo about the fact that there is a power asymmetry between developing country governments and companies, the fact that they are able to lobby, and the fact that they are also, through their power asymmetry, able to exploit these developing countries as a result. The second thing they say is that countries are able to control these companies in the government counterfactual when you have these stocks, the fact that these countries now have sheer voting power, the fact that there are many leverages such as selling assets, all these things, which means that countries are able to control these companies in the government counterfactual. The third thing they provide is impacting, which is that they are able to reduce the exploitation and pollution and all of these terrible practices done by these companies. And in the best case of opening government, these developing country governments are able to direct these corporations to act in certain ways that are beneficial to the domestic economy and the industry of developing countries. At this point, I will note that it's not necessarily clear what these corporate actions that are beneficial to the economy actually looks like, or how this is going to function, or whether this is feasible or not. But we do see that this is probably one of the scenarios that opening governments wants to claim. So what did opening opposition have to say in this round? Largely three things. First, I think opening opposition engages with the opening government's central impact on exploitation, etc. They package this as saying a holistic rebuttal in need of opposition when they say that exploitation is likely to be solved anyway. This sort of response is also present in Deputy. And all in all, they say, for example, things like attention to ESG already exists, investors already care, there's a global check and balance system, consumer awareness, journalism, cancel culture, all of these things. And they say that as a second layer response, they say that even if these sort of like exploitation could be solved in government world exclusively, or could be solved in government world to a significant extent compared to the opposition world, they still say that insofar as these corporations are able to provide jobs, insofar as these corporations are able to provide economic benefits to these domestic economies, then probably the existence of these MNCs is likely to be beneficial either way. The second thing that opening opposition says is about financial risk, and this is about how these investments are likely to take place in ways that are not necessarily efficient or strategic, and leading as a result to a huge fiscal risk of these developing country governments. The fact that these investments is likely to concentrate to certain areas, or in the inefficiency that emerges as a result of bureaucracy, etc., and the impact being that the fiscal situation of these countries becoming worse. Okay. And the third and final thing I will note about opening opposition is that they say how companies are likely to be ran in terrible ways in the government world. This comes not only from the inefficiency mechanism that I've already raised, but there's also this mechanism of populism and short-termism within politicians, which means that, for example, leader of opposition says that these corporations are likely to be industries with large voting blocks. The leader of opposition context is manufacturing, and this context per se is contested. But I think that the general analysis that these politicians are likely to cater to and specifically target these industries with large voting blocks, this general analysis should probably still apply to some extent. And then there is also a note of short-term incentive of politicians, and the impact being that these companies are going to lose long-term vision and lose competent board members, all of these things. So so how do we resolve this clash? Mainly two things. First, to which extent will the behavior of MNCs improve within developing countries? I think opening opposition provides significant mitigation in terms of forces rather than in terms of like forces other than acquisition of shares, and how these problems of exploitation and terrible practices by corporations can be solved to some extent on their side of the house, but also opening opposition provides some weighing as to what, even if there is some degree of exploitation existent in opening opposition world, still why that is not necessarily likely to be an important thing or a damaging thing for opening opposition world. There is some weighing there. So the conclusion being that the delta that opening government is able to claim regarding exploitation, regarding bad practices by corporations in general, such as pollution, is probably mitigated to some extent. The second thing to note here is the existence of these MNCs likely to be beneficial to these developing countries. So opening opposition talks about fiscal instability and how that is likely to be especially the case given that politicians run to short-termism, populism, all of these things. Opening government talks about how they are able to regulate corporations from acting in terrible ways. But the conclusion here is that as a panel, we thought that opening opposition's characterization of how developing country governments will interact with these corporations, the fact about things like short-termism, etc., this characterization probably still remains. And in this regard, even though we can see that the worst harms might be prevented on opening government side, in some instances, it's hard to see why this is the most likely scenario. And we think that it's fair to credit opening opposition scenario, given that opening opposition adds reality to their scenario by giving us a characterization of how governments are likely to act in perverse ways that are counterproductive for the economy of these developing countries. Okay, so opening opposition above opening government. Next, closing government. As a panel, we thought that closing government had mainly two contributions. The first is characterizing countries and why developing countries and why they are likely to control companies in ways that are actually beneficial to developing countries. This is sort of fulfilling the opening government, which did not go far as closing government in terms of really explaining what it means for these countries to have control over of these companies and why that would be beneficial to these developing country economies and how capacity-wise that is likely to happen. Housing government talks about delegation of certain jobs that require expertise, the fact that there is voter accountability, how politicians are likely to cater to tangible benefits for people on the ground, meaning that they are likely to advocate policies that make sense, financial sense for these companies, which leads to things like maintaining employment or like, more like, I don't know, integration of businesses with domestic actors, etc. The second thing to note here is impacting of what it really means for countries, to have control over multinational corporations. The scenarios given by closing government looks like, for example, diversifying growth, unlocking technologies, building an independent industrial ecosystem within these domestic economies, preventing race to the bottom through international cooperation. And the weighing, they say, is that long-term growth is more important than marginal harms that are given by opposition. But of course, this weighing is contingent on those long-term benefits actually happening. And how did we see this? We thought that diversity of growth, diversification, etc., is probably one of the likely scenarios within closing government, but we did not necessarily credit this as like to a significant extent. We did not credit it to an extent where, for example, diversity of growth is more very likely to happen, etc. But we would say that it is probably likely to happen to a certain extent. So how does this interact with opening government? Three ways. First, I think closing government, as I just already mentioned, I think fills in characterization and adds reality to the scenario of opening government, where countries will regulate companies in sensible ways or in ways that are beneficial to people. This is important because it deals better against opening opposition's attack on the OG's premise that countries are likely to act in ways that are irrational and does not make any sort of business strategy, like strategic sense in terms of business. But also, I think this mechanism was necessary for opening government to claim their impact to some extent. So, which is to say that this is not necessarily just an impacting extension. Closing government is able to add these mechanism of, for example, delegation of expertise, etc., to say that to claim these impacts. Secondly, closing government is better able to impact what corporate practices are and how that are beneficial to developing countries look like. etc. We think that this is probably present in opening government to some extent, but I think the degree of impacting we took heavier from closing government. But thirdly, I think closing government is free from rectifying terrible corporate practices, which is an impact, a significant portion of opening government case is probably reliant on. We think that even if opening government might lose the opening exchange on this grounds, on the fact that their delta is being mitigated to a certain extent by opening opposition, I think closing government is free from these sort of engagements, meaning that closing government probably is able to claim a larger delta so far in this debate. So, opening opposition and closing government. I think two things to note here. First, closing government is able to mitigate the financial risk point given by opening opposition to some extent. We would not say it's like it critically flipped or critically took down these points, but we would say that we can probably say that it was a mitigation. How the fact analysis such as overdependence is being the status quo, and how that is likely to exist less in our world, in government's world. But also, I think closing government talks about professional M&A companies coming in, or voter inspection leading to more accountability, which probably means that this, yeah, it's probably fair to say that it equalizes the opening opposition's analysis and characterization to some extent, which means that at this point, the comparison comes down to the nuance regarding to which extent can we credit both teams' scenario, to the nuance with which in which extent can we credit the both teams' impact? And I think that in this regard, closing government provides the aforementioned characterizations and the contextualizations as to what these developing countries are going to look like in the government world. And we think that in this regard, we were more willing to credit this scenario compared to opening opposition's analysis, which had, in terms of characterization and adding nuance to their impact and counterfactual, not necessarily as clear as the material provided by closing government. The second thing to note in this short diagonal exchange is how companies will behave under the control of developing country governments. Opening opposition says that all governments behave irrationally, and we thought that this was obviously a very creditable scenario. I think that closing government does have a couple of responses to this. The first is that there is voter accountability, which means that politicians don't destroy the company by, for example, encouraging nonsensical corporate practices, etc., which is likely in some instances. But we don't think this alone takes on opening option points. But also, I think it's worth noting that closing government talks about explaining the realistic comparison, or given the capacity analysis as to how these sensible corporate, how should I say, sensible corporate policies that benefit developing countries are likely to happen in closing government's world, about illustrations about, for example, conglomerates, etc. Means that although it's not necessarily clear whether it's likely to be conglomerates per se, but probably we can see to some extent that there is a realistic comparative in closing government world where this developing economic development, healthy economic development, is likely to emerge. Okay, the conclusion being that in terms of depth and the explanation on how developing countries will control companies, we thought that closing government marginally had the edge. Okay, closing opposition. Mainly two contributions we identified as a panel. First is the risk of concentrating investment and why that is bad. And this was not just an impacting extension. We could see that there were new, of course, mechanisms such as things like path dependency, although it's not necessarily clear why these additional mechanisms are, even if they were proven, are significantly important within this debate, because opening opposition note that already provides explanation on how investment is likely to concentrate to certain corporations, especially ones that are manpower heavy. The second thing is that workers on the ground are in fact harmed even more under the control of the government, and the incentive here is that companies and MNCs have incentive to lower the price of and have active incentive to oppress workers and to oppress other companies to get profit. There are many analyses here about how you want to be relatively more powerful than other people, and you want etc. All of these things, things like resources and opportunities being limited, and and the impact being that countries' benefits don't necessarily trickle down to people on the ground. It's not necessarily clear why this is likely to exacerbate in opposition's world, but also, sorry. So why did we think that it's not clear why this exacerbates? It's because opening government to some extent already gives us a problem analysis as to why these terrible exploitations are taking place in the status quo. So we think that even in opposition world, when this when there is government control, in the government world, that when there is government control on these companies, and why even if it got like marginally worse, is that difference in terms of exacerbating how to which extent is this difference significant in this debate, we were not necessarily clear about. But also the thing to note is that the counterfactual in opposition world is not necessarily clear. So for example, why would diversification happen to a meaningful extent in closing opposition? I think this was also pointed out by government whip. Okay, so how does this engage with opening opposition? Largely three things. First, I think the unique contribution for example, of providing new mechanism for concentration. This is not necessarily clear. The second thing is that opening opposition has larger contribution of killing government's impacts. And the third thing to note here is that opening opposition does a better job of illustrating a counterfactual where governments are likely to act in pernicious ways. Okay, opening government over closing opposition. Note that this, I think I referred at the beginning of the OA, but this is a fairly close call. But I might have been willing to, if we had more time to discuss with panelists, and if the panelists had more compelling reasons for OG below CO. But I think we still have to acknowledge a couple of things. First is that OG's constructive material still deserves some degree of credit, given that relevant mechanization impacting is already present, as we have already covered. But secondly, I think at least OGs are better able to illustrate and show that OG's counterfactual and its benefits are more exclusive, which is to say corporations rectifying terrible practices to some extent and probably in opening government's world. But the third thing to note here is that I think PM sort of mitigates closing opposition's impact of bad corporate practices to some extent at the point where they are able to explain why corporate practices are bad in the status quo. I think CEO necessarily had to prove why it'd be significantly worse in their world in order to claim a larger delta, a larger impact within this debate. Closing government over closing opposition. The first thing to note here is there was a clash of diversification versus concentration. Even if we distinctly credit closing opposition for the impacting an additional mechanization of concentration, I think closing government provides alternative scenario of diversification, which means that this is contested by closing government to some extent. This may not be a critical engagement from closing government, but probably some degree of mitigation is present there. The second thing is, why will governments prioritize the interests of rich people above voters? I think I think closing opposition provides a lot of incentive analysis as to why rich people have incentive to oppress people. But the problem I had is that even if they had these sets of incentives that member of opposition explains, it's not necessarily clear why it's able to override and crowd out other incentives that governments have, or crowd out, or whether there is even capacity on the side of rich people to actually make these governments enact these policies. And I think this question is legitimate, given that there is, through the government bench, there is characterization as to why governments would care about, well, not even government bench, in opening opposition world as well. There is a government incentive to care about the voters, what they think, and giving them tangible benefits, etc. So it's not necessarily, and CEO's response here is that, well, developing countries are not necessarily democratized. Maybe this is probably true in certain instances, but I don't think, but we could not see why this, we could not clearly see why this is likely to be the majority context. And the third and final thing I want to note about CG CEO comparison is how will the situation improve in closing government? I think that in this regard, closing government had a clearer characterization and impacting on how corporate behavior is going to change and why those change in behaviors are likely to impact the developing country economies in ways that are beneficial for them. So that's the OA.